Welcome, viewers, to the Inside Interviews podcast. And we hope this is an enlightening series of academic discussions where we go into depth on a variety of unique topics. So we don't try to just choose the same topic every time. After this episode, be sure to check us out on our website, shiaresearch.ca, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Today, we are pleased and honored to have Dr. Thijl Sunier. He's the Professor Emeritus of Anthropology of Religion and the Chair of Islam in European Societies at Free University in Amsterdam. He is also the Executive Editor of the Journal of Muslims in Europe, published by Brill. He is also the member of the editorial board of CADOC at Louvre University, which is a documentary center. And he was also previously the visiting fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity in Göttingen, Germany. Dr. Sunier recently published a work which I think is of profound importance. It's called Making Islam Work, Islamic Authority Among Muslims in Western Europe, published by Brill. In this book, Professor Sunier explores how Islamic authority is made in Europe and within societies, how people assent to authority, how it's constructed, how it's contested, how it's negotiated, particularly looking at it through an anthropological lens, which is his area of specialization. I truly think this book is profoundly relevant. In fact, I was showing it to a student of mine the other day who's doing his PhD on Shi'ism in Canada. And I was just mentioning how relevant this is, and it should be perhaps on his, at least if not in his bibliography, but if not, a part of some comprehensive exam on the subject, because I think that's how important the book is and groundbreaking when it comes to how Muslims have come into the West, particularly in Europe in this case, and negotiated that identity and found an identity. And that identity is multivocal and multifaceted. And a part of that is how they negotiate with religious authority within their own communities. Professor, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Let's get started with my first question, which is, what is a social scientific approach to Islamic authority? How does your research intersect by what you describe? So that's the second question, but we can get to that in a bit, with what you describe as an anthropology of the secular. So you have a social scientific approach to Islamic authority and the anthropology of the secular. Could you shed some light on this and a little bit about, I guess, how you came to writing this extensive book?
Yeah. Thank you. Well, just let me start with your last question. The reason why I decided to write this book, and by the way, it's based on old research I did back in the 80s and recent research and some research of some of my PhD. So it's actually a kind of bringing together various research projects, but then through the perspective of Islamic authority, because I was not very satisfied with the way Islamic authority is addressed, or actually is not addressed. There's a kind of a taken for granted assumption that we all know what it is. But let me start with a kind of a daring, but also very telling statement by one of my interlocutors, also an Imam. I talked to a lot of Imams, and he said, well, we as Muslims, of course, we consider the Quran as that's the word of God. That's a direct revelation of the word of God. We assume that. But then he said, and that was really kind of, I found in the beginning I found it shocking, but then I understood what he meant. He said, well, if people do not take that as the revelation, as the direct word of God, then What can we do? So there is always this, that was his argument, there's always, in the end, people need to, abide by that. They need to agree on that, and so there's always this human element in in making communities, in senses of belonging, in the way you relate to religious authorities, persons, or text, or what have you. So your question about what is the social scientific approach to Islamic authority is precisely, it's processional. It's something that has to do with it. It should be constantly conferred. There is interaction between people and text, or people and religious professionals, or whatever. And I'm, as an anthropologist, I'm interested in that. I'm interested in the human made, what people make of religion. Buildings, text, all kind of activities around that. And I think that for me is the kind of the essence, or the core business of anthropologists, social scientists. They are interested in, not so much in text as such, but what people do with text. What they why they choose, why they make certain distinctions. Why do they select and choose, for example, certain ways of understanding instead of others? So that's a kind of core business of social scientists. So that's what I did. Then this book is about Muslims in Europe, and there is a kind of, again, taken for granted assumption that when Muslims migrated, because the Muslims in Europe have apart from Muslims in Southeastern Europe, in the Balkans, they have a migration history. Their parents or their grandparents migrated from countries like Turkey or Morocco, mainly Tunisia, to Europe, and later on there were refugees from Iraq, from Syria, etc. So Islam came from outside, from abroad, to Europe. That's the idea. So the idea, the assumption is always Muslims entered the European countries, and they entered a kind of what is called a secular liberal context, political context. And again, my dissatisfaction with the way of dealing with it, or way of analyzing that, is that as if this is a kind of objective political formation. I mean, the liberal secular is a political project, is a kind of envisioning the future about society. So it's a kind of a normative understanding of a self-understanding of European countries, what they are. And if you look at newspapers, politicians, but also a lot of scientific academic publications, you see that, again, this is taken for granted. Europe is a secular liberal continent, and Muslims enter this, and they have to deal with that. My point is, and I go along here with the work of Talal Assad, to whom very much I'm indebted to, because I very much I appreciate his way of dealing with it. He said the secular, as much as religion, are categories for governments to govern religion. I mean, the secular is not a kind of a political realm where religion is taken out. That's not how it works. So this so-called secular context, secularism, which is supposed to exist in Europe, is much more far more complex than many people assume. So this kind of dichotomy between the religious and the secular, and again, I follow Talal Assad here, is problematic in my view.
This is, I can't help but think that a lot of this has to do with post-colonialism, right? I mean, this whole idea that these European countries were once conquerors. They conquered many, parts of the Muslim world or Muslim majority countries. They were ascendant, they were dominant, they were very large military economic forces. And they were used to having their way with the world, in parts of the world. And now those very same subjects have come home, are now migrating to those countries, but not within the context of colonization anymore, but now in the context of equal citizenship, allegedly equal citizenship. And what does that mean? And how is citizenship negotiated with religion and religious identity in a, it's all just, as you said, very complex. It's very, very, very complex. And I wonder in the 80s, as you do mention, in the 80s, when some of these early Muslims were coming, well, I mean, Islam, of course, existed earlier, but when you see this first kind of waves of Muslim immigration in the 80s to Rotterdam, tell us a little bit about that time, 80s and 90s, because you do address it quite at length in your book, and it's quite important.
Yeah, sure. Well, there is a number of things to say about it. The overall argument in my book, as I said before, is, if you want to understand the making of Islamic Authority, you have to take into consideration much more than just the kind of religious understanding, the kind of narrow theological understanding of authority. The circumstances under which people operate are very important. And this chapter in my book is based on research I did back in the 1980s for my dissertation, for my PhD research. And it was the time, and that's why I think if you look at Muslim communities in Europe, you have to take into consideration this migration background. And also, as you say, and I agree, colonial background. And there are differences. I come to that. But in this chapter, which was based on this research in this particular city, what I observed, what I discovered was that there were these, at the time when most Muslims were, well, they had no knowledge whatsoever about societies to which they migrated. And many of them had a low education. They came from often kind of semi-rural areas, etc. And then they were parachuted in cities, in urban centers in Europe. And what happened then was, it's the same in many other countries in Europe, is that there were the earlier migrants. So there was a kind of the forerunners, the people who came, say, a decade earlier. And they, when there was this mass migration, they started to act as a kind of middlemen, intermediaries, people who helped them. And they did a good job. And many of them I know and still know. They are all retired. I mean, it's a long time ago. But these people, they were entrepreneurs. They were brokers. They were in between the societies, the host societies, and the Muslim communities who had no knowledge whatsoever. So they didn't speak the language, that. So in this situation, under these conditions, at least some of them developed a kind of powerful position, and they were also very important in the early stages of the building up of a religious infrastructure. Acquiring room for prayer, building mosques. It's a constant negotiation process with local administrative authorities, etc. And these people played a very important role. And what I observed, and this is very, very interesting, in this whole process of building up a religious infrastructure, they in a way developed a kind of authoritative position, even when it comes to, all kind of religious matters. And you would expect, when they don't have they are not professionals. Some of them had a short religious education, but many of them didn't, and still they had this powerful position. And I was wondering, when I did my research, I completely overlooked that. But what I did was rereading my old material, and I found out there's something going on there. It's very interesting. And it was temporal, because, as long as these early migrants were ignorant or were kind of had no knowledge about society, their position was powerful. But after years, this waned, this power decreased, simply because people could take care for their own business. So you see a shift, and that is precisely what I found the kind of temporality I found interesting. Now I come to your question about colonization. There is a difference. Take, for example, the UK and France. France and UK, the majority of Muslims there come from former colonies. They are former colonial subjects. And in my country, in the Netherlands, there's only a tiny minority of Muslims coming from former colonies, from Suriname and from Indonesia. But it's compared to Moroccan and Turkish Muslims, it's a tiny minority. Now once I heard somebody, I think it was in France, and he said something like to the French society and to the government, they said, "We are here because you were there." So this attitude of, don't tell me what to do. After all, it is because you occupied our land, and this is the kind of origin of the whole migration that took place afterwards. So don't bother me with that. Well, the interesting thing is, if you look at, for example, Turkish Muslims in Germany or in the Netherlands or in Scandinavia, there is still there's a different attitude. These early migrants, they said, well, we are guests here. They felt like guests, and they said, well, we should behave like guests, and this is a different attitude. Now, what you see in the subsequent generations, and I find that much more interesting and intriguing, the younger Muslims now from Turkish or Moroccan background, also in the Netherlands, they say, we are citizens here. We want to have equal rights. That's fine, but we are also citizens, and we don't want to be treated as a kind of second-rate inhabitants of this country. So this idea that you could observe in the 80s and the 70s among these former colonial subjects in the UK or in France, the idea of we are here because you were there, that didn't exist with these early labor migrant Muslims. But that's something you see in among later generations, younger generations. They say we are citizens of this country, and we demand to be treated equally. If I may, let me give you a kind of a shocking example. We had 2 weeks ago here in the Netherlands, we had a clash. There is the tension, you were well aware of that, of the war in Gaza, and
yeah.
There is in many countries in Europe, there is a kind of a clash between pro-Israel and pro-Palestine, etc., etc. Well, anyway, what happened was that in Amsterdam there was a football match where a football team of Tel Aviv, Israel, was playing. And then there was a clash later on between young Muslims or whatever. That's after all what the police and what politicians said, and these supporters of the Israeli football team. Later on, it turned out that the hooligans, the supporters of this football team, they started. They were demolishing people. They were grabbing Muslim women with a hijab, grabbing the hijab, etc. So it was a very kind of tense situation. And it was immediately framed by the government, by the Dutch government, which is a right-wing government, as a clash between Jews and Muslims, which was, nonsense. It had nothing to do with that, but that's the way it's framed. And the point is, then there were these talk shows, and then all the experts were asked, well, what is the reason why these young Muslims do that? And then some people say, well, they have an integration problem. But in fact, it is partly because they say, well, after all these years, we are still second-rate citizens. We do not belong here. So what you see is a very strong kind of emphasis among young Muslims here, and I very well understand that, of being treated equally, without any reference to religion. It doesn't matter what religious background I have. I am a citizen in this country, and I want to be treated equally. That's the kind of atmosphere that you can feel across Europe.
And to this effect, which there's so much on my mind, but on one hand, you have this Muslim population, which is growing. It's huge in Europe, across Europe, Germany, Amsterdam, France, the UK. You have these Muslims that have come, and to a certain extent, a portion of them or a large portion of them are maintaining some sense of religiosity practice. And that practice is an overt practice, especially in the case of the hijab, in other practices, fasting, for example, at work, so on and so forth, finding places for prayer, as you mentioned, right? It's not so much a privatized, sanitized religion kind of swept away into the corner.
Yeah.
So how have European governments attempted to negotiate this? Because it's not going to go anywhere on one hand. So how have European governments attempted to maybe influence its trajectory?
Yeah. I see your point.
And that's something you discuss in the book.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about that. But let me start with, the overall picture is that, how can I formulate that? I mean, the point is that Muslims came to Europe, and they settled here. They turned into, well, citizens. The younger generation was born here, etc. So this is the kind of sequence, the kind of development you can observe with regard to. And the point, and then at some point, the important question is raised whether these Muslims are, then some scholars speak about or pose the question whether or not there is a European Islam or a Dutch or a French or whatever Islam. The point is, my argument here, or my take on this is, from the moment Muslims came to Europe, there was a European Islam. I mean, but what European governments try to do is, and I have referred to that in my book also, but I wrote a separate article on that, what I call the domestication of Islam. And what I mean by that is that there is a kind of inherent logic in nation state that they want to organize religious activities, you know, whether that's the building environment or whatever, according to a kind of a national format, and that's what I call domestication of Islam. This is something you could see not only with Muslims, with Islam, but also with other religions. There's a kind of a nationalized form. This is a political project of European nation states. And of course, there are politicians who are, for example, we have the most powerful politician in my country at the moment, Geert Wilders, is the extreme right-wing party, is the biggest party, unfortunately. But as far as he is concerned, he wants to get rid of mosques, etc., etc. So he's very, but this is impossible. I mean, there is, as I said, there is a constitutional freedom, and that's the case in all European countries. So there is a freedom of, you know, religious expression, which means that you cannot, as a government, you can try to inhibit, or you can try to frustrate the kind of setting up of this infrastructure, but you cannot forbid it. I mean, that's basically the point. This is what happens. But then what you see in all these countries is that this building up of this religious infrastructure is always kind of conditioned by legislation. There's a kind of national legislation, and you have to act according to that. There are all kinds of regulations about, you know, financing, flow of money, etc. This is all regulated. But then on top of that, there's always the negotiation that brings in the kind of personal convictions, the assumptions of the negotiators on the part of the government. They say, well, we need to do. All in all, this is always a process that is consistent with, you know, how religion should be organized along these national kind of principles. And this is the same with other religions. Now, what is interesting is, again, also in many European countries, in all Europe, there is this principle, constitutional principle, equality of religions. So there is no, I mean, formally speaking, I say formally speaking, there is equality between Muslims and Christians, Jews, etc. Okay, that's fine. The point is that in many countries, the whole building up of this religious infrastructure and this coming into being of, you know, a religious landscape, an Islamic landscape, was more successful when Muslim actors were better, had more knowledge, had more experience with how things worked in that country. So they said, well, these are the venues, these are the strategies we have to adopt in order to be able to, for example, open a mosque somewhere or set up anything else. So if you know the rules, of the game, you know how to do that, you are more successful than when you don't do that. And earlier we talked about these early migrants and these brokers. Well, they knew the tricks and they knew how to do that. Today, this is of course much more widespread among Muslims. So the point is, legally speaking, European governments cannot do very much. In an article I wrote 2 years ago about the bureaucratic incorporation of Islam in European societies, my argument was, you know, this bureaucratic incorporation means that Muslims are kind of legally incorporated in society. They have certain rights, etc., or they have negotiated certain things, and then in this way, this whole landscape came into being. But the other side of the coin is that the more a religion such as Islam is bureaucratically incorporated in European societies, the more the governments of these societies have the possibility to control, to monitor all kind of processes, and that's a flip side of the coin. This is how it works, and the idea of a privatized, religion as a kind of purely privatized affair. My colleague Jocelyn Césari, maybe you know her name. She's very much kind of supporting this kind of argument. They said, well, there has been a process of individualization and privatization of religion in Europe. That's a long process, historical process, taking 2 centuries or whatever. And the only option Muslims have is to do the same. Well, the problem I have with that kind of argument is that do other religious communities, such as Christians or Jews, are they completely privatized? No, absolutely not. They also have their infrastructure. They also have they have political parties. I mean, in some countries, there are political organizations with a clear religious identity or religious parties. So the idea that Christians, Jews, and what have you are privatized and Muslims are kind of still holding on to a kind of collective identity or that's nonsense. That's a myth. There is, of course, also privatization, but that is not very different from what you see among other religious communities. And in fact, and that's another point I always want to emphasize, is don't underestimate. I mean, many people still have this kind of perception of Muslims as indeed a kind of a backward collective community. This is absolutely not how it is. This is not the situation you can observe if you speak to Muslims and you see what they do. It's complex and it's much more diverse than many people assume. So that's a long answer to your. This is the kind of context in which Muslims arrived.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would add to that, and it is a context to which Muslims in the meantime, contemporary Muslims, contribute. I mean, they are part of it, even if some people do not like that. This is what it is.
And at the end of the day, these governments, these European governments, and I would say North America as well, but we're speaking about Europe, they admitted them, knowing full well that they're Muslims. No, I mean, they must have had some idea that Muslims have a certain set of beliefs, have a certain set of practices. I mean, what was the expectation? That they would come to Europe and shed the hijab and maybe shed the beard or whatever it is that is unappealing with regards to their.
Was
that the expectation on behalf of certain foreign ministries?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely the point. And in fact, I mean, in some countries more than in others, what you see after the Second World War is indeed a process. I mean, that's something that can be supported, substantiated by demographic survey, large-scale statistical research, that there was a rather quick kind of deconfessionalization, more and more people not adhering to any religion anymore. the problem is, you probably know that also from the situation in the United States and Canada, because I don't think it's very different. The idea was, now we got rid of religion, and then come Muslims with their religion. So there was this idea as if there was a kind of, what is it? They were thrown back in time. They came with their traditions and things, and they wanted in European societies continue the way they lived, and they didn't have any idea about the place of religion in society. Well, this was the attitude and the atmosphere and the kind of rhetoric you often heard, certainly in the 1980s, but still there is this idea that Muslims are a kind of behind us, behind the rest of society, which is, sorry, it's nonsense. I mean, you can very easily debunk that by referring to all kinds of things. I mean, schooling, labor situation, etc. It's very easily refutable. Yeah.
And to that effect, and we're now getting into the heart of this Islamic Authority discussion, a new generation of imams are now coming up. And you discuss that in your book. And this is, I think, extremely important. It intersects both Sunni and Shi'i concerns across the board, which is, how do imams, sheikhs, scholars, whatever we want to call them, or sheikhas, female scholars, deal with this new environment and educate, pastor to, or guide and spiritually counsel youth today who are at once European, and on the other hand, their background is as Moroccan, Turkish, Lebanese, Pakistani, whatever it may be, and their Islamic identity is a part of their life, but at the same time, they have this intersectionality because they're also British, or they're also citizens of the Netherlands.
Absolutely.
How are imams negotiating this new and complicated, but I would say exciting time in terms of this anthropology of religion?
Yeah. Well, the second chapter of my book is indeed, I call that chapter "The Politics of Imam Training," because I mean, imams were there right from the outset. I mean, there were already imams in Europe in the 60s, let alone before the war. But I mean, catering the migration population, they were already there in the 60s. But but the whole discussion about the training, what is a good imam? What kind of training should an imam have? Now, for a long time, and that's different in different countries how that is organized. But for a long time, institutions in the countries of origin, and the most powerful of which is, for example, the Diyanet, which is the official state institution of the Turkish government. Imams are trained there. That's still the case. And from the early 1980s, there were agreements across Europe with countries of origin to send imams, well-trained imams, to cater to meet the needs of Muslims in Europe. There were no qualified professionals here. There were people who were leading the prayer, but there were no people with sufficient religious knowledge, etc. So then there were these agreements to send imams from the countries of origin to Europe. And European governments, the early 1980s, were very happy with that. Why? Because first they didn't have to bother about that. So, well, that's their that's their problem, and they have to deal with that. But secondly, they expected there were also agreements with Moroccan authorities, but less so than with Turkey. They expected these imams to, not only to meet the needs of the Muslim communities, but also to help already back then governments in dealing with what they call fundamentalism. That was the word they used in the 1980s. And so that was a very easy deal. European governments did not have to do anything. They left it to the authorities in the countries of origin. Salaries were paid by them, etc. That was the situation. Now, when new generations grew up, who grew up mainly in Europe, and they were more, they had a longer time of their life lived in Europe than in country of origin, or they were born here. Increasingly, they said, well, these imams that were sent from the countries of origin and stayed in Europe for a couple of years and then went back, and then a new one came. They had no connection whatsoever with the Jamaat, with the community. They were very well versed. They were no doubt professional theologians, but they had no idea whatsoever about the condition, the circumstances in which these people lived. So this was in the 1980s. This was increasingly a kind of a problem. So they said, well, we need imams that are more experienced. They know the communities here, and they have to take that into consideration. And then you see in the 1990s, you see gradually a discussion emerging about, okay, but then how should this curriculum, how should the training of imams look like? And not so much his theological proficiency, but his work as a pastor, as somebody who is leading a community. How should that look like? So you see the origin of this whole discussion about training emerging in the 1990s. And so there were all kinds of initiatives, all kinds of private initiatives, training imams in Europe or training them in countries of origin, people who were born here, then sent back to the country of origin, to do this training and then come back, etc. All these kinds. So it's an ongoing, and there were all kinds of initiatives. But then after 9/11, which is a kind of, it's not a complete watershed, but it was a turning point. Then European government said, we need these imams also to help us with, fighting radicalization, etc., etc. So already before 2001, but more so after 2001, 9/11. European governments had a keen interest in having a say and being part of negotiations about this training, and they wanted to influence also the curriculum, etc. They said, well, we have a wish list of things these imams should learn. So what you see, and then I come to your question about the new generation imams, and also one of my imams who I spoke with, a young imam, who secondly formulate that as a an imam in countries of origin where everything is institutionalized. Well, that's a pretty easy job. That's what he said. But he said, what we have to do here, especially at a time when there were no religious theological institutions, etc., etc. We had to do it ourselves. We had to find out, although we were alim, but we were also pastor, and we were also a youth worker. We were also a neighborhood worker, etc. We had to do it. And then on top of that, the government say, help us with, taming radicals. That kind of. So the super imam, as a colleague of mine called that once. And the point is, and that's one of my interlocutors. He's a good friend of mine, by the way. He's an imam. He said something like something about the kind of a reinterpretation of sources. It's not. I mean, it's not a reinterpretation. Kind of a radical, different approach to certain religious sources. But the idea is, he said to me, if you know a lot, I know a lot about, I know the Quran by heart. I know a lot about, I read a lot. I think I'm a well-qualified theologian. But if you are not able to reach out to your Jamaat, to your community, what can you do with that knowledge? So this is something, I would say, it's not new, but it's something that is markedly different with the kind of distant imams, the kind of professionals coming from countries of origin, being detached, or what is it, employed in mosques for a number of years. It's a completely different situation. They are there, and they are. So another one, also a good friend of mine, during the COVID pandemic, he said, with my religious knowledge, I went to people in my community who didn't want to vaccinate. And then I told them, I explained to them that this is not at all a religious prohibition. Some people said, well, it's forbidden to have a vaccination, and he said, well, that's not true. I'm a theologian. I'm an alim. I know. I can tell you how things are. But if they would not trust this guy, this imam, this community, this local community, if they would not have trusted him, then he couldn't do anything. It was the trust they had him, the kind of, the kind of status as a bloke from next door. He's one of them. He's somebody in the neighborhood of the community, and in this position, in this quality, he goes to the community, and he uses his religious knowledge to give this kind of advice. Yeah.
I wanted to. This is a great segue to the section on Shi'ism that I'd like to discuss, because this was, of course, co-written by yourself, or the primary writer of this was your PhD student. I'll let you speak to that, but I'll begin with a funny question, because I just found it to be a little bit interesting, and maybe not funny, but amusing. Well, can an accountant fill that job?
Sorry, say it again.
Can an accounnt fill that role? Right? You
Yeah,
bring it up in that chapter that there's an accountant.
Yeah.
Come Shia preacher or Shia speaker, which brings this whole question of where is Islamic Authority located, who gets to speak, who's in and who's out, and how does that occur within the Shia context, particularly the Shia Majlis context. I just found that so interesting, that whole story about the accountant, and there's a whole debate if the accountant can be invited. Well, is he an accountant or an imam? What is he exactly, or what is she?
Exactly.
I mean, the whole female side of that is something else. But the point is that where is located authority? Where is authority located?
Yeah.
And how is it articulated? And who determines this? I mean, you begin the chapter yourself and the co-author with that. That's such an interesting quotation of Talha, who says it's sort of a slippery slope, because when it becomes very difficult to create distinction about who is allowed to talk and who isn't, who you should platform, who you shouldn't platform. There's some value to putting some sort of conditions. And you begin discussion on Shiism in that context. Can you tell us a little bit about the Shia chapter, and then how that kind of segues or intersects with the broader discussion about the contestation of Islamic authority?
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and I think precisely because this is in the beginning we discussed the difference between Shia and Sunni, and I think precisely here you see a manifestation of differences between Sunni and Shia. Not so much, I mean, not doctrinal differences, but the way they are organized and the way these kind of things are organized. This PhD of mine, she did research in the Netherlands. That was she herself is from Shia Pakistani background, so she is she's experienced. She knows the community, etc. She knows the rituals. She has attended many majalis in her life. So, but the point is, if you look at the kind of the level, the organizational level, or the kind of structural, the networking, etc., of Shia Muslims in many countries in Europe, maybe the UK is somewhat different, but at least in other countries, it's a tiny Shia Muslims is a tiny minority. And Sunni organizations and Sunni spokespersons, Sunni representatives are very dominant in all kinds of consultative bodies, etc., across Europe. And they dominate.
And then the question would be, well, what is his scope of practice, or his scope of practice? Okay, he could be an accountant who read some hadith or verses of the Quran at home, or is a very pious accountant. So maybe he or she
still not qualified, you mean?
But not qualified. They don't have a degree in Islamic studies.
Absolutely.
They don't have a formal training. They don't have a certificate from somebody authorizing them to teach. And that does exist, as you know, within the Shia system. The Shia system have the Hausa system, right? But again, I think because of the minority, because they're a minority within a minority, smaller numbers that clearly are not as organized. I think you would be correct to say that the UK is an exception, just because of the massive size of the community there. And to a certain extent, large cities like New York, or Toronto, or other very large cities that have very large Shia populations. But otherwise, those small, it's a lot more dispersed.
And fragmented.
And fragmented. And that's also very interesting from an anthropological perspective, because how do people make meaning of religion, meaning of their lives, when they don't necessarily have access to, shall we say, people that are, I don't like using this word, but just with air quotes around it, canonized. They haven't been.
Absolutely.
They are accountants, or they're just pious businessmen or businesswomen that want to give a lecture. And then what do they do when things go awry? I mean, clearly these accountants, or these professionals who are well-intentioned, shall we say, pious, so on and so forth, cannot handle the more complex issues per se of what is the future of Muslim identity.
Absolutely.
How do they deal with the vaccination? How do they deal with more complex jurisprudential issues?
Exactly.
Can they be brokers vis-a-vis at the high level with academia and the government, for example?
Well, no, that's it's a very important point you raise here. Well, the idea is, I spoke to many people, professionals, really I mean, ulama, really people who have a qualified. They say, well, and that's especially with the growth of all kind of digital media, where this kind of self-made ulama answer questions of people who were seeking that they are desperately surfing the internet to look for answers, etc. And then there's somebody said, I have the answer, etc. This is something what happened that happens. And well, just let me give you one I think very essential point that I also have discussed in my book. In situations where things are new, not settled, not legalized, not kind of embedded, many things can go, and many people can emerge there as speaking on behalf of a community, etc., etc., or acting as an imam. But in the end, I think that when it comes to these more complex questions, as you mentioned, vaccination, for example, but there's many more. I mean, there's a lot of. Then you really need this theological background, and that's something that there is a kind of a wide agreement on that, and the whole idea of a kind of a self-made imam or whatever is absolutely, I mean, that's out of the question. The problem is, and that's something that is in many countries in Europe, as far as I know, the function of imam, when I would say I'm a medical doctor and I treat you, that's violating the law. I mean, that's forbidden. But when I say I'm an imam, nobody can sue me or say, well, you're not entitled to do that. I can act as an imam without having any problem. And there are several cases in Europe now and in the present, in the past, where there were discussions about that. So then people were accused of you say you're an imam, but in fact you're not, because it's a big issue. The good imam and the bad imam is a big issue.
Yeah.
But again, I think there is a general agreement that if you do not have sufficient theological knowledge, you're nowhere. Nothing works, and then the charlatans or the would-be, will disappear.
Yeah, and I mean, and I'll end off on this note, and you can maybe comment on this just to conclude. Is at the end of the day, Islam does not have a clergy. There isn't a sanctioning body in Islam per se. These are informal constructs that have come along the way, and they can reform themselves and change themselves again. There isn't a priesthood, right? Where there is a higher governing council that gives and removes somebody's priesthood, or whatever you want to call it, makes them a bishop and makes them a cardinal, makes them a a pastor, or whatever you call it, whatever it may be called. It's very disparate, and historically there has been this tension with over control, because then through that comes influence, changing the religion, based on political needs, political power, based on money. So I'll just give you an example here. This is and this might kind of inform the Shia angle a little bit. In Iraq, particularly in southern Iraq, where a lot of ulama go to get trained, in the city of Najaf, there is a general ban or absolute dislike on receiving any money from a foreign government, particularly from the Iraqi government, because there's this extreme caution with foreign influence on the region, with political foreign influence, which would then reshape the sacred.
Absolutely. Well,
mixing it with the profane.
Yeah. In Europe, this is very similar. This kind of anxiety about money flows, etc., influence, what have you. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
And that is both, I guess, a boon in some ways for some, and it's also a negative thing, right? So it's there we are, the making of Muslim authority in Europe, a very complex subject.
There is almost anecdotal. A friend of mine, good colleague of mine in Lithuania, who is he's working on Islam. He wrote a book, recently published a book, where he shows how in the in the eastern outskirts of Europe, Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic states, but then also southeastern Europe, the Balkan, etc., where the same you see happening here in Western Europe is what I call domestication. He calls that the churchification of Islam. And what he means by that is, when there is a problem, and I remember during the Rushdie affair in '89 was a big thing here, then governments in Europe were desperate because there was no what is it, pope, an Islamic pope, to whom they could address and ask things, or etc. So what you constantly see is, and that's the discussion or the we had about the qualification of imams. They also should be the kind of pope of a community, the kind of thinking and perceiving community through the lens of Christianity or Catholicism. You have kind of, there's on top there's somebody who is authoritative and leading the communities, etc. And we as governments, we can simply go to this person and he will solve all our problems. That is a kind of, that's a kind of ideal what is it, depiction of an imam. And the whole idea, as you say, well, there is no clergy in Islam. They do not bother about that. I mean, they need somebody who can can speak on behalf of the community. And, that's it's this is a kind of tension, and I would say these kind of things are more important or have a greater impact than whether or not Muslims enter a so-called secular liberal political context. It's I mean, you need in most countries in Europe, all countries in Europe, and I think also it also counts for the United States and Canada. You need a sufficient, you need to be experienced in negotiating and understanding how they see you, in order to be able to negotiate, effectively. That's something that I learned from many Muslims I know, who also acted as negotiators or whatever. They said you need to know how they perceive us, whether that's true or not. And if they think that a mosque is a church, which is also nonsense, of course, and an imam or whatever is what is it, the pope or
some
then
kind of
okay, so be it. That's how they talk about this. And if we constantly hotly deny that you're all wrong, this is not how it works, well, then negotiations are more difficult. That's yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Sunier. We really appreciate your time today. Thank you to the viewers for joining us and listening this far. It was really a wonderful conversation. Visit our website, our social media, our YouTube channel for more content. If you enjoyed today's conversation, then perhaps think about contributing to the Shia Research Institute for more quality content in the future. Once again, thank you, Professor, for joining us.
And I really thank you for the conversation, and I really enjoyed it, and I think it's a great initiative. This. So.
Okay, all done.